Hi, my name is Chanda Bailey, and this evening I'm going to prepare a Kabocha squash black soybean stew from Alicia Silverstone's Kind Diet. I've made a few modifications because I didn't have any Kabocha squash this evening, so I'm going to use butternut squash instead. I've also made a few other slight modifications. The recipe calls for 2 to 3 cloves of garlic. Instead, I've used 5 because I really love garlic. It also calls for a red onion. I've used yellow. And it also says to saute the onion and the garlic in olive oil, but instead I use water. I've also added a little bit more celery and cilantro than the recipe calls for. So I'm waiting for my onion and garlic to start sizzling, and then I'm going to add the seasonings here, which are a pinch of sea salt, which works out to be about a 1/4 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon of cumin, 1 teaspoon of chili powder, and a generous pinch of crushed red pepper. So it's starting to bubble up a little bit right now. Once that gets going, I'm going to simply just add the Kabocha squash, or in this case the butternut squash, about 3/4 of this can of diced tomatoes. It calls for about 2½ cups, and then I'm going to let that cook down. It calls for 8 ounces of mirin and also a cup of water, so I have already added the mirin and the water together in the measuring cup. So it's starting to sizzle, so I'm going to go ahead and add my seasonings. And stir that around just a little bit. I'm going to let that cook down just a tiny bit, let the onions soften just a tiny bit more. The other thing I should note is that her recipe calls for raw soybeans, and because of time constraints, I think, which is common with a lot of us, I've just gone ahead and used the canned black soybeans tonight. It's starting to smell really good. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the squash, and this is again about 1/2 of a squash, not a full squash. And about 2½ cups worth of diced tomatoes. And then I'm going to pour in the mirin and the water. And you just cook this until it's just soft. So, it depends on how big your cubes of squash are, but it's about anything from 10 to 20 minutes. In the meantime, I also have some brown rice cooking to serve this over. Okay, we've just come back, and I've just tested the squash. This was covered the whole time while it was cooking, and it's nice and soft, but not so soft that it's mushy. It's just kind of that, I don't want to say al dente, but just tender to the cutting of the spatula. What I've done here is I took the white miso paste, and I just took some of the broth out of the squash and kind of dissolved the miso. You don't ever want to put miso into something boiling or even simmering, because that breaks down the enzymes in there, or whatever the beneficial properties in the miso. So I've now taken that off the heat, and I'm going to go ahead and add the black soybeans. Those have already been rinsed and drained. And I'm just going to stir those around a little bit, and I can actually keep the heat on just a tiny bit still, just to get those beans nice and warmed up, because they're already pre-cooked. It doesn't really have to be that long. So I'm just going to get them stirred in there really well. And now that it's not at a boil and a rapid simmer, I can go ahead and add the miso. And this is again a modification I made. The recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of miso paste, and I use quite a bit more than that. It's probably closer to 2 tablespoons. Again, just personal preference. I really enjoy the taste of miso. So I'm going to add that in there and stir it up really well. Oh, and it smells wonderful. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add the cilantro and the celery. We don't add this to the mixture while it's cooking, also because the celery adds a nice crunch after it's cooked. And also the cilantro tastes much fresher when it's raw like this. It's not one of those herbs where you need to cook it into something to get the full flavor. It's really, really great this way. It's super colorful. It's one of my favorite fall recipes. Okay, so our final product, I've gone ahead and cooked up some short grain brown rice, and I'm just going to ladle some of the squash stew onto the rice. And I can't tell you what it is, but sometimes when I make this, there's a little bit less fluid or it's a little bit thicker, and sometimes it's thinner like it is tonight. It still works great with the rice. I think sometimes if it sits a little bit longer, the squash breaks down and probably thickens it. And there is the finished product.